Returning now to the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve's comments accusing the Prime Minister's top aide of being arrogant and not understanding the Constitution. Comes after Dominic Cummings reportedly told MPs it's too late to stop a no-deal Brexit. So, are we facing a constitutional crisis in the lead-up to Brexit? To help answer that, joined by the Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London, Professor Robert Hazell. Hello to you, Professor. Thanks for joining us. What do you think?
Well, I think it could be a constitutional crisis if, come September or October, it's clear that Boris Johnson and his government are heading for no deal, and if the House of Commons is determined to try to block that.
And how would that manifest itself, the crisis?
Well, when Parliament comes back in early September, they will expect a statement from the government about the progress or lack of progress in negotiations with the EU. And it should become clear pretty quickly whether the government is then determined to head for no deal, as the Prime Minister has said, no ifs, no buts. And the House of Commons then has various ways in which it might try to prevent that. One would be to try to get control of the agenda one day in Parliament and to pass emergency legislation to extend the deadline beyond the 31st of October. A second might be, and this would be the real emergency break, to put down a formal no confidence motion in the government. And by convention, the government would then have to find time to debate that motion and vote on it very swiftly in the next few days.
And of course, all politicians serve at Her Majesty's pleasure. She very rarely actually gets involved in the inner workings of Parliament, but could she?
Well, she might get involved if there were a formal no confidence motion, which was successful. So the House of Commons would formally have said, we have no confidence in the government led by Boris Johnson. And if, as some have suggested, I think rather wildly, he then refused to resign. If he refused to resign, it's possible that the Queen would then dismiss him from office. But I think the Queen would only do that if the House of Commons had also indicated very clearly to the Queen that they would have confidence in an alternative Prime Minister. The Queen would certainly not dismiss Boris Johnson if that created a vacuum, because we must always have a government. And she would not dismiss Boris Johnson unless it were very clear to her, and the House of Commons had signalled that clearly, that they would have confidence in somebody else.
Parliament, of course, or rather the Prime Minister could dismiss Parliament, if you will, by proroguing them or not, because there's a lot of conversation about whether that is possible or not for the Prime Minister.
Well, again, it's not a power of the Prime Minister. The power of prorogation is a prerogative power that rests with the Queen. And if, as normally happens at the end of a parliamentary session, the Prime Minister then advises the Queen to prorogue Parliament, she follows his advice. But that's the advice of a Prime Minister who commands the confidence of Parliament. If there's been a successful no confidence motion, then by definition, the Prime Minister no longer commands the confidence of Parliament, and the Queen is then no longer obliged to follow his advice. So if in those circumstances he then asked the Queen to prorogue Parliament, she would have a discretion and be within her rights not to prorogue Parliament.
OK, it's good to talk to you, Professor. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We appreciate it. Thank you.